The afternoon of the Elmsford Rose Show had the mild sweetness of ripe raspberries, and the agreeable bustle of villagers who felt the day, for once, had arranged itself sensibly. The green was a patchwork of stalls, bunting, and ladies in straw hats who made quite as much art of pointing out their friends as of admiring roses. On the far side, a band from Pusey had been coaxed into maroon blazers and a valiant rendition of a polka, while near the churchyard wall, under a canvas awning strung with paper bells, a little dais had been prepared for the crowning of the Rose Queen. Miss Jane Marple, who had been given a chair with a crocheted cushion because the rector's wife was the sort of woman who called age experience even when it was inconvenient, regarded the scene with mild pleasure. She had positioned herself advantageously by a tray of macaroons that were over-browned in an endearing way, beside a notice for the bottle tombola, written in a firm, masculine hand. It was a spot from which one could observe most people arriving before they remembered whom they meant to avoid. And Miss Marple had learned long ago that such vantage points were invaluable for understanding the true currents that ran beneath village life. She noticed, for instance, that Mrs. Beatrice Hargood at the grocer's tent had arrived with an expression of stiff virtue and a hat that sat on her head like a conscientious schoolmistress, yet in greeting she tucked a curl behind her ear like a girl who knew what suited her. She observed Mr. Julian Redwinter, stepson of the Hall's widowed owner, with that quick, good-looking restlessness that belonged to young men who knew to a penny how much was in their pocket and to a shilling how much they owed. Most intriguingly, she noted Ruth Prowse, Mrs. Redwinter's housekeeper, standing at the edge of the green with arms folded and eyes like two straight pins, watching the proceedings with the sort of attention that suggested more than professional interest. What particularly caught Miss Marple's notice was the arrival of a stranger, a woman of perhaps 50 with well-cut clothes and an air of nervous energy that seemed oddly at variance with the peaceful village setting. The woman stood at the periphery of the festivities, her sharp eyes scanning the crowd with what appeared to be recognition, or perhaps something less pleasant. When her gaze fell upon the dais where preparations were being made for the ceremony, her expression hardened in a way that made Miss Marple's gentle blue eyes grow thoughtful. They were all there for the same reason, of course. The Rose Queen, chosen that morning by committee and much argument, was to be crowned. Iris Finch, the village said appreciatively, and with a certain relish. Iris from the estate office, not the post office, the one who went into Milchester twice a week on the late bus, the one whose mother kept house by the lane and made excellent currant buns, the one whose laugh carried perhaps a little too clearly, and who had secured her new position by typing up plans for cottages. The one who had looked very pretty at Whitsun and was very nearly pretty now in her borrowed gloves, though Miss Marple detected beneath her half-embarrassed, half-triumphant expression the particular vulnerability of girls accustomed to being looked at, who pretend to mind the attention. As Iris approached across the grass, flanked by children who had tied pink ribbons to their wrists, Miss Marple observed the various reactions of the assembled villagers. The Reverend Larch held the crown with an expression suggesting he found ceremonial both a duty and a worry. Mrs. Amelia Redwinter, tall and elegant in grey silk that had once been more expensive than it looked now, smiled with the sort of warmth some women bestowed because it was good for them to be thought warm. Young Tom Pierce from the garage, his fingernails cleansed for the occasion to a degree he found humiliating, kept very purposefully not looking toward the lemonade tent, from which came the profile of a pale woman with narrow, anxious eyes. Miss Marple noticed small things, as was her habit. She observed the wicker screen brought from the hall's morning room and positioned behind the dais to create a theatrical background, noting that one of its worn casters had been made level with a little stack of pennies. She saw how the hem of the calico drape skirting the dais was already somewhat muddy despite the dry grass, suggesting someone had been adjusting it recently. Most tellingly, she watched the interplay of glances between the various participants, the sort of silent communication that often revealed more than words ever could. Mrs. Hargood, who had managed to position herself at Miss Marple's elbow without appearing to have moved at all, remarked in a confidential tone that carried further than some announcements that it was a lovely choice. Iris Finch, though the way girls had ideas nowadays, one might almost think being Rose Queen was the same as holding a proper position. She added, with the sort of moral observation that connected seemingly unrelated phenomena, that the allotment nearest the road had had carrots stolen from it the previous week, and her opinion was that morals and vegetables suffered declines together. On the dais, the Reverend cleared his throat in preparation for his ceremonial duties, speaking of roses and young womanhood and the thriving of villages when there were shared responsibilities. The moment had arrived for the crown to be placed, and Iris lifted her chin as if she had been waiting for this particular instant since childhood. The assembled villagers pressed closer, cameras were raised, and even the band managed to produce something appropriately pastoral. It was then, as if summoned by the heightened attention, that one of the awning's supporting pegs gave way with a soft twang, causing the canvas to dip and flap in an entirely predictable manner. Nothing serious, merely the sort of minor chaos that occurs when ropes and gentlemen's good intentions meet, but half a dozen men immediately leapt forward to make themselves useful. Mr. Redwinter raised his hand authoritatively. The band halted their melody with a somewhat discordant flourish, and it was decided, without formal discussion, that the sides of the awning should be temporarily lowered to allow the peg to be properly reset and prevent the crown from being placed askew by the resulting draft. The two girls with ceremonial sashes pulled the curtain-like canvas down along one side, creating a gentle shadow over the wicker screen and lending an intimate quality to the space beneath the awning. There was something almost theatrical about the enclosed area now, with the white of Iris's dress gleaming in the filtered light, the crown catching what illumination remained, and the faint scent of hot calico and lilies creating an unexpectedly sacred atmosphere. Miss Marple, rather than watching the mechanical adjustment of the pegs, found herself observing the faces of the crowd during this brief interlude. One could learn much from such moments, when people's attention was divided and their usual social masks might slip slightly. She noted the small boy in the cap who squeezed forward, calculating whether heroism in peg adjustment might earn him additional sweets. Dr. Sylvia Carberry leaned on her umbrella and glanced toward a young man with hollow cheeks, someone she had been encouraging to eat properly for weeks. Tom Pierce rubbed his freshly scrubbed fingers together and stared fixedly at his boots, while the pale woman by the lemonade tent said quietly to the tent pole that she had lost the habit of breathing easily, a comment that seemed to surprise even herself. At the crowd's edge, Mr. Lenton, the photographer from Milchester with a mustache that had outgrown its host, raised his camera in anticipation of the canvas being lifted again. He preferred candid shots to formal poses, finding truth in people caught honestly bored, children sticky and unguarded, ladies captured mid-glance when they thought themselves unobserved. He framed the awning carefully, noting the outline of the wicker screen and the suggestion of a girl's silhouette behind the canvas. The peg was reset with the small triumphant sound of things obeying mechanical laws once again. The two girls with sashes prepared to lift the canvas, and the air seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. The moment had come to resume the ceremony, to place the crown and complete the ritual that would make Iris Finch the Rose Queen of Elmsford. The canvas was raised, bright afternoon light flooded the dais, and the assembled villagers prepared to applaud. The dais was empty. The fact took a moment to register, as such impossible facts often do. There was the cushion with its familiar dent and little fringe, the wicker screen with its supporting coin still neatly in place, the Reverend with his mouth partially open and the crown still poised in his hands, looking simultaneously ridiculous and solemn. A white glove that one of the girls had dropped lay like an answer to a question nobody had thought to ask. Where Iris Finch had been standing, where in the natural order of things she should still be standing, there was nothing but the gentle movement of the calico drape and a single lock of peach-colored ribbon that had caught on the corner of a chair. The silence stretched for what felt like minutes but was probably only seconds. Mrs. Redwinter, not a woman given to gasping, did not gasp, but turned her head sharply before bringing her expression under control and announcing with the clarity of someone accustomed to giving orders that Iris could not have gone far, and would the children please refrain from running toward the road. The Reverend, finding himself for the first time in his tenure holding a crown with no head beneath it, managed only to say, "My dear," to no one in particular. The band, being men faced with an unprecedented situation, initially did nothing. Then, remembering they were paid to provide music, began to play with a bravery that sounded remarkably like embarrassment. A ripple of confusion ran through the green as if someone had thrown a stone into still water. The polite laugh with which people typically greet minor mishaps when they wish to be kind did not make itself available, for this was clearly not a mishap of any ordinary sort. Mrs. Hargood, after a long moment, suggested it must be some sort of theatrical trick, the kind of thing one saw in London shows, though tricks, as she pointed out, generally included a return to normal circumstances. People began to crane around the sides of the dais, seeing only grass and the unrevealing back of the wicker screen. Children ran in earnest now, despite Mrs. Redwinter's clear instructions. Tom Pierce took several unnecessary steps forward, then one back, as if returning something he had not yet picked up. The mysterious stranger Miss Marple had noticed earlier remained at the crowd's periphery, and if Miss Marple was not mistaken, her expression now held something that might have been satisfaction, or perhaps relief. Miss Marple herself did not press forward, having learned long ago that one often saw more by remaining precisely where one was. Instead, she looked with her gentle, seemingly near-sighted blue eyes at several things others had overlooked. She observed the edge of the calico drape where the mud stain was, noting that it now bore a thin line just above the original mark, as if the cloth had been caught and then freed. She saw that the topmost penny in the stack supporting the wicker screen's leg had a shining rim where a thumbnail might recently have pressed it. Most significantly, she heard young Poppy Larch, who had ceased picking at her ribbon because she had knotted it anxiously tight around her wrist, say in a small voice not so much to anyone as to the day itself, "But where did the lady go?" The question hung in the air with the sort of helpfulness that allowed other, less useful observations to be made. Men were dispatched with appropriate urgency to check behind the hall, the shrubbery, the lane. Mrs. Redwinter herself stepped down from the dais with admirable composure to examine what could be seen behind the screen. Ruth Prowse, allowing her expression to soften by a degree, observed flatly that Iris had likely gone off of her own accord for reasons not to be discussed in public, which managed to be both the worst sort of optimism and the best sort of malice in a single manageable sentence. It was then that a small commotion arose from behind the dais, not a scream, for Elmsford was not given to screaming, but the sort of tidy exclamation people make when discovering something small and objectionable. One of the girls with sashes emerged in the awkward half-run of someone maintaining self-control, carrying something wrapped in a handkerchief and refusing to be hurried into revealing what it was, which suggested she had been taught that care was preferable to speed. The band faltered and stopped entirely, though the larks on the far hedge continued their songs undisturbed. The smell of strawberries became suddenly too sweet, and Mrs. Hargood put a hand to her throat as if to prevent it from leaping. Mrs. Redwinter returned, notably composed, and announced in tones that indicated she had decided both whom to be and what to do that there had been a minor accident involving a ribbon, that nothing significant was to be made of it, that Iris had perhaps become faint, and that the men should search the south border and the old orchard shrubbery. Miss Marple, who had observed many instances of genuine fainting and understood their true manifestations, sat a little straighter and rearranged her gloves thoughtfully. She did not follow the crowd in their increasingly frantic search. Instead, she looked up at the awning's ridgepole and the way the knotted cord lay, and only then did she glance down to smile with unfeigned tenderness at Poppy Larch, whose mouth was beginning to tremble with the sort of distress that comes when the adult world suddenly stops making sense. "It is the oddest thing," Miss Marple said, not to enlarge upon the mystery, but to make people less afraid of naming it. The child nodded fiercely, relieved that an elderly woman could acknowledge what a child dared not voice. And Miss Marple, moderate and calm in her crocheted cushioned chair, felt the world hold its breath around them. It was the sort of perfectly ordinary day on which something entirely inexplicable had happened in full view of everyone, and yet nobody at all had seen it occur. The search that followed possessed the peculiar quality of organized confusion that overtakes well-meaning people when faced with something that defies reasonable explanation. Mr. Julian Redwinter had taken charge with the natural authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, dispatching groups of men toward the various boundaries of the green, while the ladies examined the immediate vicinity with systematic thoroughness, hampered only by their reluctance to appear undignified in their Sunday clothes. Miss Marple remained in her chair for 1 minute longer than anyone sensible would have done, which allowed people to forget she was there entirely. Then she rose, speaking quietly to the rector that Poppy would do very well with a biscuit, and drifted in the general movement toward the dais, without appearing to have any particular object. At close quarters, the traces were as suggestive as interrupted conversation. The calico skirt bore a new faint line of dirt with a scalloped look, as if fabric had been pulled over an uneven surface, and the cushions emitted a whiff of sachet that was not the lilies on the table, nor Iris's familiar violet scent, but something cleaner that Miss Marple associated with women who boiled their underthings without complaint. One of the sash girls, the careful one, still clutched a handkerchief parcel with the reverence of someone guarding something precious. Miss Marple did not reach for it, but her gaze rested with kindly insistence until the child lifted the corner. Inside lay a silver dressmaker's pin, long and sharp, with a narrow ribbon of peach pink threaded through its eye and a tiny brown smear on the ribbon's knotted end. "From the crown," the girl whispered, as if admitting to sacrilege. "It was caught." The brown smear was not blood. Miss Marple rubbed the idea against memory and recognized the telltale stain of Dr. Carberry's iodine, the sort that left patches on cloth when applied to fresh scratches. Ruth Prowse appeared at Miss Marple's shoulder with the smooth efficiency of someone accustomed to controlling household effects. She took the handkerchief without asking, saying too pleasantly that anything concerning the crown would naturally be returned to Mrs. Redwinter. Miss Marple watched the woman's hands. The nails were square, the thumb strong, the cuticles slightly raw. They belonged to someone who would not hesitate to press a bright rim on a penny to level a wobbly caster, though they had not done so today. Mr. Lenton, the photographer from Milchester, sidled closer with his camera bag, addressing no one in particular, and therefore everyone. "Caught a frame when the panel came down," he said, attempting jovial and landing on anxious. "Shadow play what?" Looked like two figures for a second. The silence that answered him was not because people had not heard, but because they had heard too well. Mrs. Redwinter's glance was instantaneous and contained. "You will develop your plates carefully, Mr. Lenton," she said, which in another tone might have been encouragement, but here was clearly instruction. Mrs. Finch arrived from her cottage in a state of controlled panic, her hands twisting a dish towel she had apparently forgotten she was carrying. Her immediate question about whether Iris had seemed upset struck Miss Marple as the sort of inquiry that revealed a mother's intimate knowledge of her daughter's temperament. Young Tom Pierce abandoned his assigned search area to prowl the edges of the green with restless energy, muttering that Iris was strong as an ox and had never been one for fainting spells. The mysterious stranger who had caught Miss Marple's attention earlier moved closer to Dr. Carberry with purposeful steps. "I am Ada Vale," she said quietly. If there was recognition in the doctor's face, it was quickly schooled. "I have come about a girl." The words carried weight that extended beyond their simple meaning, and Miss Marple filed them away with the other accumulating oddities. Behind the wicker screen, something bright winked in the shifting light. Miss Marple tilted her head and glimpsed the polished edge of a compact mirror, snapped shut and slid just out of casual sight. She did not reach for it, but lodged it in her mind alongside the iodine stain and the scalloped dirt mark. The afternoon light was taking on the golden quality that preceded evening, and what had begun as a brief interruption had consumed nearly 2 hours. The cheerful bunting now seemed to mock their efforts, and the reality was settling over the villagers like a cold shadow. This was no simple case of a girl wandering off overcome by heat and attention. Something deliberate had occurred in plain sight of everyone, yet nobody had seen it happen. The lengthening shadows brought with them a subtle shift in the atmosphere of the green, as if the failing light had permission to reveal what daylight had kept hidden. The cheerful bunting now fluttered with a melancholy air, and the abandoned Rose Queen's crown caught the last rays of sun like a reproach. Miss Marple observed this transformation with the quiet attention she gave to all changes in human behavior, noting how people's voices had dropped to hushed tones and how they moved with the careful deliberation of those who feared what they might discover next. Constable Webb arrived from the village station on his bicycle, his uniform pressed and his notebook at the ready, bringing with him the reassuring weight of official procedure. He was followed within the hour by Inspector Chittenden from Milchester, a compact, thoughtful man whose motorcar announced its arrival with the authoritative rattle that suggested serious business was at hand. The inspector's keen eyes took in the scene with professional assessment. The empty dais, the restless clusters of villagers, and the particular quality of Mrs. Redwinter's composed demeanor that spoke of someone accustomed to managing crises. Under the awning, Inspector Chittenden and Constable Webb conducted their examination with methodical thoroughness. The trampled grass beneath the dais told its own story, and Miss Marple, joining them with the unobtrusive manner of someone whose age granted certain privileges, pointed out the scalloped dirt mark on the calico's inner hem and the telltale track where the wicker screen's caster had been shifted forward and back again. "The screen was moved," the inspector concluded, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone finding expected confirmation. "When the canvas was lowered, someone used that moment to create a corridor of concealment." The compact mirror that Miss Marple had noticed earlier lay where it had fallen, its silver surface catching the lamplight that was beginning to supplement the fading daylight. The inspector examined it carefully through his handkerchief, noting the worn initials inside the lid that might have been AV, or perhaps something else entirely, scratched by use until they had become more suggestion than certainty. The discovery prompted a ripple of interest among the gathered villagers, each wondering if they might recognize this small, intimate object that had become evidence. Ada Vale, who had maintained her position at the crowd's periphery since her earlier conversation with Dr. Carberry, stepped forward with the decisive movement of someone who could no longer remain silent. "Inspector," she said, her voice carrying the authority of professional training, "I believe this matter concerns more than a simple disappearance. I'm a nurse from London, and I came to Elmsford specifically seeking a girl who would be 19 years old, born on the 15th of March. I have reason to believe she may be in considerable danger." The revelation transformed the evening's investigation from a puzzling local incident into something far more serious. Dr. Carberry's sharp glance toward Ada Vale suggested recognition, or at least the stirring of professional memory. Mrs. Redwinter's composure, which had remained admirably steady throughout the afternoon's chaos, showed the first signs of strain as she absorbed the implications of Ada Vale's words. Young Julian Redwinter, who had been prowling the edges of the search with restless energy, stopped his pacing to stare at the London nurse with an expression that combined surprise with something that might have been alarm. Inspector Chittenden's questions began with the systematic thoroughness that marked experienced police work. The physical evidence was carefully catalogued. The shifted screen, the scuffed calico, the compact mirror, and most significantly, a length of rope that Julian had discovered near the kitchen garden wall, cleanly cut at one end and frayed at the other, suggesting recent and deliberate preparation. Miss Marple noted that Ruth Prowse watched this inventory with particular attention, her usually steady hands betraying a slight tremor as she smoothed her skirts. Tom Pierce, whose earlier search efforts had been hampered by obvious distress, now stood with his sister Hilda near the lemonade tent, their whispered conversation punctuated by anxious glances toward the official proceedings. Mrs. Finch, supported by neighbors who had rallied to provide practical comfort, maintained her vigil with the determined dignity of mothers who refused to surrender hope, though her eyes held the growing shadow of fear that comes when afternoon mysteries stretch into evening realities. As the inspector prepared to expand his investigation beyond the immediate scene, Miss Marple made her own quiet decision. She would remain close to observe those who stayed behind when they believed the official attention had moved elsewhere, for she had learned that people often revealed their truest selves in the moments when they thought themselves unobserved. The inspector's methodical approach to gathering testimonies began in earnest as the evening shadows lengthened across the green. Inspector Chittenden had commandeered a corner of the church hall, where the steady light of oil lamps created an intimate space for questioning that somehow made truth-telling feel both necessary and inevitable. Miss Marple, having secured a seat near the flower-arranging supplies where she could observe without seeming to intrude, noted how each person's manner changed subtly when called to account for their afternoon. Mrs. Finch was among the first to be questioned, her maternal anxiety having crystallized into the sort of precise worry that comes when a mother's worst fears begin to take concrete shape. She sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, the dish towel finally abandoned, and spoke of Iris with the careful detail of someone who had spent 19 years memorizing another person's habits and moods. Yes, Iris had seemed nervous about the ceremony that morning, but it was the pleasant nervousness of a girl who knew she looked well and was prepared to enjoy the attention. She had taken particular care with her appearance, using the heated tongs that Mrs. Finch kept wrapped in flannel for special occasions, and had worn her best white dress with the pearl buttons that had belonged to her cousin. When Inspector Chittenden's questions turned to Iris's background, Mrs. Finch's composure wavered for the first time. The inspector's gentle but persistent inquiry about birth certificates and early records brought a flush to her cheeks and a tremor to her voice that spoke of long-held secrets suddenly exposed to official scrutiny. "Iris came to me when she was very small," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Her father asked me to care for her, and I promised I would say nothing of the circumstances until it became necessary. Perhaps now it has become necessary." The admission hung in the air like a confession, and Miss Marple observed how several people in the room shifted uncomfortably, as if Mrs. Finch's revelation had disturbed more than one carefully maintained fiction. Ruth Prowse, when called upon, provided her testimony with the contained efficiency that marked all her interactions with authority. She had arrived early to supervise the screen's placement, she explained, because Mrs. Redwinter expected such details to be handled properly without requiring her personal attention. The pennies supporting the wobbly caster had been her own practical solution, implemented without consultation because she disliked asking permission for obvious necessities. During the ceremony itself, she had positioned herself near the lemonade tent, where she could observe the entire proceedings and intervene if required, as was her habit at village events. Miss Marple, listening with the gentle attention she brought to all human revelations, noted that Ruth's account contained slightly more mechanical detail than seemed necessary. The woman's hands, as she spoke, showed that faint yellow-brown crescent at the base of one thumb that Miss Marple had observed earlier, a stain that matched perfectly with Dr. Carberry's iodine, the sort that left its mark when applied to fresh scratches or small wounds. When Inspector Chittenden asked about the compact mirror, Ruth's glance toward it was swift and carefully controlled, neither claiming nor disclaiming ownership, with a sort of precision that suggested considerable thought had been given to the matter. Julian Redwinter's testimony carried the restless energy of a young man who found himself under official scrutiny for reasons he did not entirely understand. He had been positioned near the band during the ceremony, he explained, where he could signal them if musical adjustments were required. Though his attention had been divided between his duties and his observation of the crowd's behavior. When pressed about his relationship with Iris, his jaw tightened with the particular defensiveness of someone whose private feelings had become subject to public examination. "She worked in the estate office," he said carefully. "We spoke about business matters, rental agreements for the tenant cottages, that sort of thing." Yet Miss Marple, watching his face as he spoke, saw the flicker of something deeper in his eyes, a vulnerability that suggested his connection to Iris extended beyond mere professional courtesy. Ada Vale's account, when she was called to provide it formally, revealed layers of complexity that transformed the afternoon's mystery into something far more serious than a simple village disappearance. She was indeed a private nurse from London, she confirmed, but her current mission involved more than medical care. 3 weeks earlier, she had been contacted through professional channels by someone seeking to locate a young woman born in Elmsford 19 years ago on a specific date in March. The matter concerned family obligations that had been left unresolved, she explained carefully, though the precise nature of these obligations had not been fully disclosed to her. Her investigation had led her to believe that Iris Finch matched the description she had been given, hence her presence at the Rose Show. The revelation cast new shadows over the assembled testimonies, and Miss Marple observed how each person absorbed this information according to their own particular concerns. Mrs. Redwinter's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, while Dr. Carberry developed the thoughtful look that medical professionals wore when connecting previously unrelated symptoms. Tom Pierce, rather than showing the surprise one might expect from someone learning that his sweetheart harbored secrets, went very still in the way of people receiving confirmation of something they had already suspected. As the formal questioning continued, Miss Marple made her own quiet catalogue of observations. The compact mirror, she noted upon closer examination, bore not only the scratched initials that might be read as either AV or RP, but also a small dent near the hinge that suggested recent impact with something hard. The rope discovered by Julian showed the clean cuts of deliberate preparation rather than the frayed edges of accidental wear. Most significantly, the ground beneath the wicker screen, when examined with proper attention to detail, revealed the faint impressions of more than one set of footprints, suggesting that Iris had not been alone behind the makeshift backdrop during those crucial 4 minutes. Inspector Chittenden's methodical approach was establishing a framework of facts, but Miss Marple sensed that the most significant truths lay not in what people were saying, but in the careful spaces between their words. The evening light was failing rapidly now, and with it, the comfortable assumption that Iris Finch would simply reappear with an embarrassed explanation was giving way to the darker possibility that her disappearance had been neither accidental nor entirely voluntary. The village that had gathered that afternoon to crown a Rose Queen was discovering that it harbored secrets far more complex than anyone had imagined, and that the girl who had vanished in plain sight might have been someone else entirely from the person they thought they knew. The transition from formal questioning to active investigation occurred with the natural progression that marked Inspector Chittenden's methodical approach. As the testimonies concluded, the inspector recognized that words alone would not solve this puzzle, and his attention turned to the physical evidence that might provide more concrete answers. Mr. Lenton, who had been clutching his camera case throughout the evening's proceedings, stepped forward with the suggestion that developing his photograph might reveal details invisible to the naked eye during those crucial moments when the canvas was lowered. The rector, eager to assist the investigation, offered the vestry as a makeshift darkroom, and within the hour they had contrived a light-proof space where the familiar scents of hymn books and beeswax gave way to the sharp chemical tang of photographic developer. Miss Marple positioned herself respectfully outside the improvised darkroom, though her keen ears caught every word of the hushed conversation within as the image slowly materialized in the developing bath. When the photograph emerged from its chemical bath, it revealed details that transformed speculation into evidence. The image showed Iris's pale face turned slightly away, her posture suggesting the breath-held stillness of someone acutely aware of being observed. More significantly, a second figure was visible behind the calico, a darker silhouette of medium height with hair drawn up in a practical style. One arm was raised purposefully, the hand positioned at shoulder level as if performing some swift, precise action at the edge of the canvas. Between the two figures hung what appeared to be a narrow, dark line, possibly cord or ribbon, and at the lower edge of the print, the corner of the wicker screen cut off a portion of the scene entirely. Inspector Chittenden studied the photograph with professional satisfaction, noting aloud that the evidence confirmed his theory about the screen being moved to create a corridor of concealment. Miss Marple, when invited to examine the print, observed mildly that the second figure appeared remarkably practical, a comment that made Mr. Lenton shift uncomfortably as he disliked having conclusions drawn for him by elderly ladies. The investigation's momentum accelerated when Dr. Carberry arrived at the vicarage, summoned by the rector's wife to determine where her medical expertise might be most needed. Her conversation with Miss Marple proved illuminating, particularly when the gentle observation was made about iodine's tendency to leave faithful stains on fabric. Dr. Carberry confirmed that she had treated two small injuries that afternoon: a scratch on Ruth Prowse's thumb before the ceremony, caused by a careless encounter with a pin while arranging drapery, and later a nick on young Poppy Larch's finger when the excited child had experimented with the crown. The significance of this information became clear when Dr. Carberry added, almost as an afterthought, that she had seen Ruth behind the awning tugging the skirting straight well before the peg incident had occurred. This detail aligned perfectly with the iodine stain found on the crown's ribbon and cast Ruth's later claim about being near the lemonade tent throughout the ceremony in an entirely different light. The evening's discoveries continued when Constable Webb returned from his expanded search bearing a pearl button wrapped carefully in newspaper. Found on the moss-covered coping of the kitchen garden wall near the service gate, the button was immediately recognized by Mrs. Finch as belonging to the set that had adorned Iris's dress, inherited from her cousin and carefully preserved for special occasions. The location of this evidence suggested a deliberate path from the dais toward the hall, indicating that Iris's disappearance had followed a planned route rather than random flight. Inspector Chittenden's decision to search the hall's service areas proved equally revealing. In the laundry, where the steady rhythm of late washing filled the air with the earnest smell of carbolic and scorching linen, they found evidence of hasty but systematic cleaning. Ruth Prowse, maintaining her composed efficiency, explained that the household had immediately begun washing tablecloths, stained with spilled cordial and dust-covered carpets, trampled by helpful villagers. On the laundry table lay a length of narrow peach ribbon, wet and coiled, which Ruth claimed had been soaked to remove dust for potential reuse from the bunting decorations. Miss Marple, examining the ribbon with gentle interest, noted the faint ghost of an iodine stain still visible where a knot had been tied, evidence that water alone could not entirely erase. The careful arrangement of the laundry, with aprons neatly folded and gardening gloves hung precisely on their peg, spoke of someone who understood that the appearance of innocence required meticulous attention to detail. Meanwhile, the inspector's formal questioning had begun to focus increasingly on Julian Redwinter, whose nervous energy and defensive responses regarding his relationship with Iris marked him as the investigation's most obvious suspect. His discovery of the cut rope, combined with his inability to provide a clear alibi for the crucial minutes of the ceremony, satisfied the inspector's need for a straightforward solution. The young man's obvious distress and his evasive answers about Iris's character painted a picture that appeared to confirm the police's growing suspicions. However, Miss Marple found herself increasingly skeptical of this convenient conclusion. Her long experience with human nature had taught her that the most apparent solutions were rarely the true ones, and the accumulating evidence suggested a complexity that extended far beyond a simple case of romantic entanglement gone wrong. Tom Pierce's revelation, extracted through careful questioning, that Iris had confided her fears about having to leave Elmsford due to dangerous complications from her past, indicated that her disappearance might have been less sudden than it appeared. Dr. Carberry's admission that Ada Vale had contacted her 3 weeks earlier, seeking information about births that had occurred under circumstances requiring discretion 19 years past, added another layer to the mystery. The convergence of Ada's search, Iris's fears, and the carefully orchestrated nature of the disappearance suggested that multiple parties had been working toward this moment, each with their own understanding of what was at stake. As the village settled into an uneasy night, with constables posted at key points and volunteers maintaining their search of the surrounding countryside, Miss Marple reflected on the pattern emerging from the evidence. The compact mirror with its ambiguous initials, the precisely cut rope, the iodine-stained ribbon, and most significantly, the photograph showing 2 figures working in apparent cooperation behind the canvas. All pointed toward a carefully planned operation, rather than a crime of passion or opportunity. The girl who had vanished in plain sight was becoming, with each revelation, less a victim of circumstances than a participant in events that had been set in motion long before the Rose Show began. Whether Iris had been a willing collaborator in her own disappearance or an unwitting pawn in someone else's design remained to be determined, but Miss Marple was certain that the truth lay not in the obvious suspect currently occupying the inspector's attention, but in the careful observations of those small human details that revealed the real motivations driving this elaborate deception. Night settled over Elmsford with an uneasy quiet that made ordinary sounds seem conspiratorial. The click of bicycle chains as Constable Webb pedaled between his posts, the slam of a distant gate, the whispering rustle of elm leaves as if the trees themselves were debating what they had witnessed. Inspector Chittenden, after establishing a watch rota that would continue until dawn, had taken Julian Redwinter to Milchester for further questioning, the young man's pale face and clenched jaw speaking volumes about his growing desperation as the investigation's focus narrowed upon him with uncomfortable precision. Miss Marple, who had accepted the rector's wife's offer of restorative tea in their modest sitting-room, found herself studying the domestic details that often revealed more than formal testimony. The key rack by the door bore a faint smear of garden mold on the brass tag labeled "Service Gate," suggesting recent use and hasty replacement by someone whose thoughts were elsewhere. When she mentioned, in the casual voice of someone discussing the weather, that people were inclined to put things back slightly crooked when their minds were occupied, the rector's wife's small intake of breath confirmed that the observation had struck home. On her way through the church hall corridor, Miss Marple paused just long enough to catch Mrs. Redwinter's low, controlled voice from the vestry, speaking with unmistakable authority. "Until morning," she said, each syllable polished and hard as marble. "No talk, no more mistakes." Ruth Prowse's response was too soft to decipher, but its tone carried the resigned steadiness of someone who had accepted the burden of another's will for a very long time, suggesting a relationship built on more than simple employment. Outside, Tom Pierce waited in the shadow of the ancient yew with the clumsy secrecy of a good boy attempting something he feared might be foolish. "Miss Marple," he blurted when she approached, his words tumbling over each other in his eagerness to be heard. "I didn't tell the inspector because he thinks I'm simple about anything that isn't engines, but I heard a motor at the back lane near 3:30. A Morris 8, grey one. I know the sound, because the choke's temperamental and it idles funny. Nobody from our garage keeps one tuned like that. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing with nervousness. If Iris got over the kitchen garden wall like they think, someone was waiting to take her up there. Miss Marple thanked him with the gentle gravity that transformed his boyish observation into valuable evidence, and Tom's shoulders dropped with visible relief at being treated as someone who had contributed something sensible rather than merely romantic speculation. He removed his cap with the old-fashioned courtesy his father had taught him, a gesture that spoke of respect earned through genuine attention to his concerns. Back in the church hall, Ada Vale stood with Dr. Carberry by the flower-arranging cupboard, her professional composure showing signs of strain as the evening's revelations accumulated. "I thought it would be easier," she admitted in a voice intended for the doctor's ears alone, but carrying far enough for Miss Marple's sympathetic attention. When one believes she is owed the truth after 19 years of searching, but time has a way of complicating even the simplest reunions. Dr. Carberry's reply was professionally kind, urging patience and rest, though her eyes betrayed the quickening curiosity of someone whose medical training had taught her to recognize symptoms of deeper complications. Inspector Chittenden, perhaps recognizing Miss Marple's reputation for noticing significant details, permitted her another examination of the compact mirror before securing it as evidence. She took it in her gloved hands with the absent-minded delicacy of someone adjusting a piece of jewelry, pressing gently at the small dent near the hinge that had caught her attention earlier. The catch released with a tired click, and the thin inner rim shifted beyond its usual position, allowing a sliver of paper, folded small and thin as a communion wafer, to slide into her palm. Miss Marple moved toward the lamp with a murmur about needing better light, unfolding the paper with a sort of reverence that did not draw unwanted attention to her discovery. It was a torn corner of ruled foolscap, bearing a familiar heading that made her breath catch slightly. Births, March 19th. Below, in careful copper-plate handwriting, a single entry recorded the 15th day with the notation, "Female child, mother unknown, father," followed by a tidy dash and the marginal note private arrangement. There was no name listed, but someone had made a faint penciled mark beside the entry, a tiny 5-petaled flower that might have been a childish doodle or perhaps a midwife's discreet identification system. The significance of this discovery settled over Miss Marple like pieces of a puzzle suddenly arranging themselves into recognizable patterns. She refolded the scrap carefully and tucked it back into the mirror's hidden compartment before the inspector's attention returned, offering him the compact with a small apologetic smile as if she had merely been clumsy with the delicate mechanism. The birth record fragment connected Ada Vale's 19-year search with Iris's mysterious background and explained the careful orchestration that had surrounded her disappearance. Meanwhile, on the green, a late lantern bobbed near the estate office where a clerk in shirt sleeves, hurriedly summoned from his evening meal, was unlocking filing cabinets for the inspector's examination. The ledgers, heavy with years of rental agreements and property maintenance records, yielded little beyond the satisfying orderliness of neat columns and careful bookkeeping. Yet Miss Marple, peering through the open window with the privilege that age granted for such innocent curiosity, noticed eraser crumbs scattered across the blotter and a faint grey smear where entries had been recently removed. More tellingly, a page had been carefully torn along the stitching, leaving the ghost of its absence like a missing tooth in an otherwise complete smile. Mrs. Finch sat in her cottage parlor with Iris's pearl-buttoned dress laid across a chair as if its wearer might return at any moment to reclaim it. She stared at the empty sleeves with the stubborn calm of women who had taught themselves not to cry when tears would only complicate necessary decisions. Somewhere in the house, hidden beneath winter clothes or behind a drawer, lay a christening shawl with lavender edging that she had never dared bring to light again, though she thought of it now with the painful clarity that comes when long-buried secrets threaten to surface. Ruth Prowse walked the dark passages of the hall with a candle and an expression that revealed nothing of her inner turmoil. She paused by the service door where the night air carried the scent of damp brick and crushed mint, standing for a long moment as if measuring her life against the darkness beyond. When she finally turned away, she smoothed the candle's wick with a wetted thumb, and the iodine stain at its base caught the flickering light like a small golden moon, a reminder of the afternoon's careful preparations. By 2 in the morning, the village had settled into the uneasy quiet of forced rest, though Miss Marple lay awake letting the accumulated facts arrange themselves into meaningful patterns. A nurse from London seeking a girl whose name had been carefully erased from official records, a lady of the hall whose composure showed hairline cracks precisely where maternal anxiety might appear, a housekeeper whose loyalty bore the hard shine of something hammered into unnatural shapes, and a boy whose knowledge of engines had provided the one concrete clue about Iris's actual departure from Elmsford. Just before dawn, Constable Webb's urgent knocking at the vicarage door brought the rector stumbling downstairs in his dressing gown, leading the officer to the sitting room where Miss Marple waited, already composed despite the early hour, her shawl arranged with the neat precision of someone who had been expecting this development. The constable cleared his throat with the formal embarrassment of someone bearing bad news. "Beg pardon, ma'am, Reverend, but there's been a break-in at the parish office during the night. The register chest's been forced open with professional skill, and several pages have been torn away completely." He consulted his notebook with official gravity. The missing records all concern births registered in March, 19 years past. Miss Marple, who had anticipated something of this nature from the moment she discovered the hidden birth record fragment, folded her hands with neat precision and reflected on how people's desperate attempts to erase the past often served only to illuminate the very truths they sought to conceal. The girl who had vanished in plain sight was becoming clearer with each revelation, not as a victim of crime, but as someone whose very existence had been carefully hidden from the moment of her birth, and whose disappearance represented not an ending but perhaps the beginning of a long-delayed acknowledgement of her true identity. Morning brought a thin, pitiless light that found its way into corners where secrets had rested comfortably in shadow. The parish office break-in had transformed what might have been dismissed as a village prank into something far more sinister, and Inspector Chittenden returned from Milchester with the set mouth of a man who had slept little and found his simple case growing more complex by the hour. The register chest bore the neat violence of a professional hand, the lock defeated with admirable delicacy while preserving the hinges, suggesting someone familiar with such work. Miss Marple, examining the scene with the gentle attention she brought to all evidence of human complexity, noted details that spoke volumes about the intruder's character and preparation. A faint dusting of blue paint on the floorboards caught her eye, tiny flakes that did not belong to the office's brown and cream decor. More tellingly, she discovered chalk residue near the window, the sort that came from marking tools or perhaps a billiards cube, and a small scraping on the sill where something metallic had been used for leverage. The precision of the work suggested someone who understood both the value of the missing records and the importance of leaving minimal trace. Tom Pierce, arriving with a borrowed pressure lamp from the garage, led them to examine the tire marks in the back lane with the expertise that belonged to young men who knew mechanical things as intimately as their own heartbeat. The impressions were clear in the soft earth. Worn Dunlop treads with distinctive chevron patterns and a neat center line, belonging to a Morris 8 that had seen better days. "No local keeps tires worn like that," Tom observed with professional certainty. "Someone stingy about replacements, or maybe someone who doesn't drive regular enough to notice the wear." He pointed to where the vehicle had stopped precisely at the service gate. suggesting the driver knew exactly where to position for quick access. At the gate itself, Miss Marple's keen eyes found a small chalk mark on the wooden post. Smudged but still visible, a 5-petaled flower hastily sketched, matching exactly the tiny symbol she had seen on the birth record fragment. A pale thread of peach-colored ribbon clung to the latch, bearing the telltale ghost of iodine staining that had become their most persistent clue. Beyond the gate, dark crumbs scattered on the path proved, upon examination, to be fresh floor polish that had transferred from leather soles, suggesting someone had been cleaning in haste before making this journey. Ruth Prowse, when questioned about her movements during the crucial hours, maintained her composed efficiency while displaying subtle signs of strain. Her hands, usually steady in their work, showed a faint blue flake wedged beneath the nail of her right forefinger, the sort of imperishable trace that clings when one handles painted iron tools. When Miss Marple mentioned, in her mild way, that people often put things back slightly crooked when their minds were occupied with weightier matters, Ruth's glance toward the key rack by the kitchen door revealed a brass tag marked Service Gate that bore fresh garden mold, suggesting recent use and hasty replacement. Mrs. Redwinter received the inspector's renewed attention with the gracious formality that belonged to women accustomed to managing difficult situations through careful application of social ritual. Yet Miss Marple observed hairline cracks in her composure, particularly when Ada Vale's expanded explanation of her mission began to emerge. The London nurse revealed that her search concerned not merely family obligations, but matters of considerable legal significance, involving a young woman whose birth had been recorded under circumstances requiring the utmost discretion 19 years earlier. Ada's professional background, when fully disclosed, proved more complex than initially suggested. She had been engaged not simply as a private nurse, but as an investigator specializing in cases where family secrets intersected with inheritance law. Her client, she explained carefully, represented interests that had remained dormant for nearly 2 decades, but now required resolution due to changing circumstances that made continued concealment impossible. The systematic destruction of birth records suggested someone was desperately attempting to prevent such resolution. Julian Redwinter, recalled from Milchester with his suspicions temporarily set aside, returned bearing the haggard look of someone who had spent sleepless hours under official scrutiny. His relief at no longer being the primary suspect was complicated by growing awareness that the situation involved complexities far beyond his understanding. When shown the photograph that revealed 2 figures working in apparent cooperation behind the canvas, his expression suggested recognition of something he had glimpsed but not fully comprehended during the ceremony. Mr. Lenton's second photographic print, developed with enhanced contrast, provided additional crucial details. The raised arm of the second figure clearly showed a narrow banding at the cuff, the utilitarian double stitch that marked the aprons hanging in the hall's laundry. More significantly, the positioning of both figures suggested not struggle or coercion, but careful coordination, as if following a predetermined plan that required precise timing and mutual understanding. Dr. Carberry's medical expertise proved invaluable when she confirmed that the iodine staining pattern on various pieces of evidence matched exactly with applications she had made to treat minor scratches sustained during what she had assumed were innocent household accidents. The brown smear on the crown's ribbon corresponded to treatment she had provided to Ruth Prowse for a pin scratch, while similar staining on the peach thread suggested the same antiseptic had been used to treat a fresh wound during the crucial minutes of Iris's disappearance. Mrs. Finch, summoned to provide additional background about Iris's early years, arrived carrying a packet of letters she had preserved with the careful devotion that mothers show toward their children's correspondence. Among them, Inspector Chittenden discovered notes that cast new light on Iris's state of mind during the weeks preceding her disappearance. One letter, addressed to Julian, expressed gratitude for kindness beyond deserts and requested silence for a little while longer. Another, surprisingly addressed to Tom Pierce, counseled him against rash action and contained the cryptic instruction to trust Miss M. The convergence of evidence pointed toward a carefully orchestrated plan that had been months in preparation, involving multiple participants who understood both the stakes and the necessity for absolute precision. Yet Miss Marple, observing the interplay of personalities and motivations, sensed that the morning's revelations had illuminated only the surface of a deeper complexity. The systematic nature of the deception suggested not merely family embarrassment, but something far more serious that had required such elaborate measures to conceal and then dramatically expose. As afternoon approached, bringing with it the promise of further developments, Miss Marple reflected on the pattern emerging from their accumulated discoveries. The girl who had vanished in plain sight was becoming clearer with each revelation, not as a victim of circumstances, but as someone whose very existence had been carefully managed from birth, and whose disappearance represented not an ending, but perhaps the beginning of a long-delayed reckoning with truths that had been buried for 19 years. The question that remained was whether this reckoning would bring justice or merely exchange one form of concealment for another, and whether those who had orchestrated Iris's disappearance had acted from protective love or more calculating motives that had yet to be fully revealed. By early afternoon, the investigation had taken on the sober rhythm of work, no longer dazzled by novelty. Inspector Chittenden set men to comb the lanes again and dispatched Webb to make quiet inquiries about a grey Morris 8 at neighbouring farms. The tire marks in the back lane told their own story under Tom Pierce's expert examination. The worn Dunlop treads with distinctive chevron patterns belonging to a vehicle that had seen better days. "No local keeps tires worn like that," Tom observed, with the confidence of someone who knew mechanical things as intimately as his own heartbeat. Someone stingy about replacements, or maybe someone who doesn't drive regular enough to notice the wear. Miss Marple, who had a way of being present at the edges of official activity in a manner that felt as natural as breathing, accepted Mrs. Redwinter's cool invitation to tea at the hall. It was offered in the tone that suggested good form required hospitality, even when one might prefer a locked door. Ruth Prowse met them at the side entrance, hair drawn up as neatly as a schoolgirl's, hands scrubbed but stained faintly at the thumb where iodine left its faithful shadow. The morning room, prepared hastily for callers, announced its mistress's character more eloquently than any declaration could have done. China placed with exacting care a small arrangement of roses in a silver bud vase, and on the mantel a framed sketch of the Redwinter arms, a shield bearing a cinquefoil, the 5-petaled flower, repeated with tasteful insistence at the corners. Miss Marple's eyes rested a moment on that neat emblem before drifting to the boot scraper near the service door, where a smear of bright, modern blue paint had caught on a nail. "We have had the garden seat repainted," Ruth said quickly, observing the direction of Miss Marple's mild gaze, though the seat was on the front terrace, not the service yard. Tea proceeded with strained decorum until Ada Vale arrived with a telegram envelope in hand. Her face pale with a peculiar mixture of relief and apprehension reserved for news that cannot be put back in its cover once read. She addressed the inspector, but allowed her eyes to include Mrs. Redwinter. "My client has responded," she said steadily. "The matter concerns legal obligations that have remained dormant for nearly 2 decades. Recent developments have made resolution both necessary and urgent." The slightest pause carried weight that extended far beyond simple words. "The documentation we seek was recorded privately in Elmsford Parish. Without it, the courts may compel disclosure through less discreet means." Silence arranged itself carefully among them. Julian, who had been standing near the window pretending indifference, turned enough to show the uncertainty in his expression. Mrs. Redwinter's reply, when it came, was a marvel of controlled sympathy. One must be very careful to protect a young woman from vulgar curiosity. If papers are missing, that is unfortunate, but it proves nothing conclusive. Ruth, at the sideboard, straightened a spoon that did not need straightening. Constable Webb's urgent arrival interrupted the fragile truce. The vestry had been entered again during the afternoon, he reported, and Mr. Lenton struck from behind while developing additional prints. Not serious, sir, but he was laid out proper. When he came to, the plates and prints were gone. Webb consulted his notebook with official gravity. There was a mark left on the shutter, chalked. Same as before. At the vestry, the air was thick with the sour, sweet smell of chemicals and fear. Mr. Lenton, colorless but indignant, insisted he had been felled like a sapling by someone who moved light as a cat and smelled of lemon oil and floor polish. The shutter bore the familiar sign, 5 petals, confidently drawn. Miss Marple stood very still, looking from the chalk symbol to the cinquefoil on the hall mantelpiece they had seen not an hour before. "How curious," Miss Marple observed mildly, retrieving a small grit of blue paint from the shutter's base, "to find the same signature appearing wherever our mystery deepens." She examined the compact mirror Ada had quietly returned to her, pressing gently at the dented hinge until the hidden birth record fragment became visible. Such pretty things, these old compacts. They hold so many secrets, don't they? Sometimes tucked away so carefully that only the right touch can reveal them. Her gentle blue eyes swept over the assembled company, noting how Ruth's hands trembled slightly as she smoothed her apron, how Mrs. Redwinter's composed mask showed hairline cracks of strain, how Ada Vale watched everyone with the clinical attention of someone whose professional training had taught her to recognize the symptoms of secrets under pressure. The afternoon light was failing, and with it, the comfortable assumption that elaborate deceptions could be maintained indefinitely when determined people began asking the right questions in precisely the right way. The theft of the photographic plates had left the village with the peculiar quiet that settles over a community when people sense that familiar certainties are crumbling beneath their feet. Inspector Chittenden returned from examining the Morris 8 with the set expression of a man whose straightforward case had developed complications that extended far beyond his initial assumptions. The abandoned vehicle, discovered where the river track met the old alder copse, bore all the evidence of hasty departure. The worn Dunlop treads that Tom Pierce had identified, a long hat pin with blue paint on its head, and most significantly, an envelope of heavy vellum bearing the unmistakable impression of the Redwinter seal, though its contents had been removed with careful thoroughness. Miss Marple, who had spent the intervening hours in quiet observation rather than active searching, found herself drawn to a conversation with the pale woman who had lingered near the lemonade tent throughout the previous day's ceremonies. Martha Lake. As she identified herself with the careful precision of someone who had grown accustomed to providing explanations for her presence, possessed the particular vulnerability of those who live on the margins of other people's secrets. She had come from Milchester, she explained, where she had resided for many years, under circumstances that required discretion, drawn back to Elmsford by the promise that she might observe the Rose Queen ceremony from a respectful distance before returning to her quiet life. The story that emerged from Martha's hesitant confidences cast the previous day's events in an entirely different light. 19 years earlier, she had been housemaid at the Hall, a position that had provided her with intimate knowledge of household arrangements that were never discussed in the village proper. There had been a private matter, she explained with the careful euphemisms that belonged to women who understood the consequences of speaking too plainly about certain subjects. Ruth Prowse had been the intermediary in arrangements that ensured a child would be cared for properly, while protecting all parties from the sort of gossip that could destroy reputations and futures alike. "The 5-petaled flower," Martha said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was our signal. Ruth would chalk it on the service gate when there were messages to be passed or arrangements to be confirmed. It meant discretion was required, and that certain conversations should take place away from curious eyes." Miss Marple nodded with the gentle understanding that encouraged further confidences. noting how Martha's hands trembled slightly as she spoke of events that had shaped the course of multiple lives. Inspector Chittenden's systematic questioning of the hall's residents had yielded additional evidence that supported Martha's revelations. Ruth Prowse, discovered at the bottom of the back stairs with a cloth pressed to her temple, insisted that she had simply tripped in her haste to assist with the search efforts. However, Miss Marple observed that the neat oval bruise rising beneath Ruth's hairline bore little resemblance to the sort of injury one sustained from contact with wooden steps. More tellingly, a billiards cube lay incongruously on the butler's tray in the morning room, its blue chalk residue matching exactly the paint flakes found at various crime scenes. The systematic destruction of evidence continued to reveal the careful planning that had preceded Iris's disappearance. The parish registers had been entered with professional skill, specific pages removed with surgical precision, leaving gaps that spoke more eloquently than the missing records themselves. The photographer's plates had been retrieved through violence that was calculated rather than passionate, suggesting someone who understood exactly what evidence needed to be suppressed and possessed both the determination and the resources to accomplish such suppression. Ada Vale's expanded explanation of her mission provided crucial context for understanding the urgency that had driven these desperate measures. Her client represented legal interests that had remained dormant for nearly 2 decades, but now required resolution due to changing circumstances that made continued concealment both impossible and potentially damaging to all parties involved. The birth records that had been so systematically destroyed contained information that would establish not merely Iris's parentage, but her legal standing in matters that extended far beyond village gossip into questions of inheritance and legitimate claim. Mrs. Redwinter's composure, which had remained admirably steady throughout the investigation's various revelations, began to show hairline cracks when confronted with the accumulating evidence of careful orchestration. Her responses to Inspector Chittenden's questions carried the controlled precision of someone who had spent considerable time preparing for this moment, yet Miss Marple detected beneath the surface calm the particular anxiety that belonged to mothers whose protective instincts had led them into territories they had never intended to explore. The discovery of additional physical evidence continued to illuminate the careful preparation that had made Iris's disappearance possible. The hatpin found in the Morris 8 bore traces of the same blue paint that had marked various locations throughout the investigation, while its length and sharpness suggested it had been selected for purposes that extended beyond mere ornamentation. The envelope bearing the Redwinter seal, though emptied of its original contents, retained the faint scent of lavender that Miss Marple associated with the sachets used to preserve important documents in household strong-boxes. Julian Redwinter's growing distress as the investigation's focus shifted away from simple criminal activity toward complex family secrets revealed his genuine ignorance of the circumstances that had shaped his household for nearly 2 decades. His defensive responses regarding his relationship with Iris took on new significance when viewed through the lens of family obligations rather than romantic entanglement, suggesting that his protective instincts had been engaged by considerations he did not fully understand. As evening approached, bringing with it the promise of further revelations, Miss Marple reflected on the pattern that was emerging from the accumulated evidence. The girl who had vanished in plain sight was becoming clearer with each discovery, not as a victim of criminal violence, but as someone whose very existence had been carefully managed from birth, and whose disappearance represented not an ending but perhaps the beginning of a long-delayed acknowledgement of truths that had been buried for 19 years under the weight of social convention and family pride. The systematic nature of the deception, the careful coordination required for its execution, and most significantly, the protective rather than predatory motivations that seemed to drive the various participants all pointed toward a resolution that would challenge conventional assumptions about guilt and innocence. Miss Marple sensed that the moment was approaching when gentle questions and patient observation would yield the final truths that had been so carefully concealed, and when the mystery of Iris Finch would reveal itself to be something far more complex and ultimately more human than anyone had initially imagined. The investigation had reached the delicate point where accumulated evidence must be transformed into understanding, where the careful observation of human behavior under pressure would reveal the true motivations that had driven people to such elaborate measures in their desperate attempt to protect what they held most dear. The village that had gathered to crown a Rose Queen was about to discover that the girl who wore the crown carried secrets that extended far beyond the boundaries of Elmsford, and that her disappearance had been orchestrated by those who loved her enough to risk everything in order to secure her future. The evening light had taken on the quality that made truth-telling seem both inevitable and merciful when Miss Marple suggested, in her mildest tone, that perhaps the time had come for certain conversations to occur in the proper setting. Inspector Chittenden, who had learned to recognize the gentle authority in her voice, agreed that the morning room at the hall would serve admirably for a final review of the accumulated evidence. The assembled company arranged themselves with the careful distance of people who understood that comfortable assumptions were about to be permanently disturbed, and the late afternoon shadows seemed to emphasize the weight of secrets that could no longer be sustained. Miss Marple began by producing the compact mirror, pressing the dented hinge with the practiced touch that revealed the hidden birth record fragment. "Such ingenious little devices," she observed mildly, "designed to hold secrets safely until the proper moment for their revelation arrives." The birth record, when examined in proper light, told a story that transformed every aspect of the investigation. The entry for the 15th of March, 19 years past, recorded the birth of a female child under circumstances requiring utmost discretion, with the father's identity indicated only by the 5-petaled cinquefoil that served as the Red Winter family emblem. "I took the liberty," Miss Marple continued with gentle precision, "of suggesting to the rector's wife that duplicate records often linger in unexpected places, and that certified copies would likely arrive from Milchester by nightfall. Such information has a way of reaching the ears that most need to hear it." Her blue eyes rested kindly on Ruth Prowse, whose composed expression showed the first signs of strain. It seemed wise to allow people to imagine an inevitability, rather than force discoveries that might prove unnecessarily painful for all concerned. Ruth's hands, clasped before her apron, revealed the faint blue flake still visible beneath her nail, the telltale trace of chalk from the cinquefoils she had marked throughout the village during her desperate attempts to coordinate the elaborate deception. When Miss Marple mentioned, almost conversationally, that the 5-petaled flower had served as a remarkably effective communication system for nearly 2 decades, Ruth's shoulders sagged with the relief of someone whose burden was finally being acknowledged. Mrs. Redwinter's composure, which had remained admirably steady throughout the investigation's various revelations, began to show hairline cracks when Miss Marple's gentle questioning turned to the systematic nature of the protective measures that had surrounded Iris from birth. 19 years is a very long time to maintain such careful arrangements, Miss Marple observed. It requires extraordinary dedication and considerable resources, the sort that suggests more than mere charitable obligation. The admission, when it finally came, carried the dignity of someone who had exhausted all other options for protecting what she held most dear. "Iris is my daughter," Mrs. Redwinter said with controlled precision, each word measured against years of careful concealment. "Born to circumstances that made acknowledgement impossible under the social conventions of our world, but loved and protected nonetheless through arrangements that allowed her to receive both material support and genuine maternal affection." Julian's sharp intake of breath revealed his dawning comprehension of implications that extended far beyond simple family secrets. The girl he had known as the estate office clerk, toward whom he had felt protective instincts that seemed inappropriate given their supposed difference in station, was in fact his half-sister. His defensive responses about their relationship took on new significance when viewed through the lens of unconscious family connection rather than romantic entanglement. Ruth Prowse's confirmation came with the steady voice of someone who had carried the burden of other people's secrets for nearly 2 decades. She had served as intermediary in all the arrangements, ensuring that Iris would be raised by Mrs. Finch while maintaining the careful fiction that preserved everyone's reputation. The iodine stains, the chalk marks, the systematic coordination of household details all represented her meticulous efforts to protect a secret that had grown more complex with each passing year. Ada Vale's expanded explanation of her mission revealed the legal pressures that had finally made continued concealment impossible. She represented inheritance interests that had remained dormant until recent developments made resolution both necessary and urgent. "My client established a trust for his natural daughter," she explained carefully, "with provisions that require acknowledgement before her 20th birthday, which approaches in 3 weeks. The missing records are essential for establishing her legal standing and securing her inheritance." The systematic destruction of evidence that had marked the investigation took on new significance when viewed through this lens of protective rather than predatory motivation. The break-ins, the stolen photographs, the violence against Mr. Lenton all represented desperate attempts to control the revelation of secrets that would transform carefully maintained fiction into legal reality with consequences extending far beyond village gossip. Miss Marple's gentle questioning revealed the final details of the elaborate disappearance that had brought them to this moment. "The Rose Show provided perfect cover," she observed, "with its natural distractions and the convenient moment when the canvas was lowered. But such careful timing required considerable coordination and advance preparation." The Morris 8 had indeed been waiting at the service gate, driven by Martha Lake, who had returned to assist in an evacuation planned for weeks in anticipation of Ada Vale's arrival. Mrs. Red Winter's final explanation came with the exhausted honesty of someone who had reached the limits of deception. The elaborate conspiracy had been designed not to harm Iris, but to protect her from exposure that would destroy her carefully constructed life while serving no constructive purpose. "We thought we could manage the transition privately," she admitted, "allowing her to step into her inheritance without the scandal that public revelation would bring. But circumstances have moved beyond our control." Inspector Chittenden, absorbing the implications of these revelations, recognized that he was dealing not with criminal activity, but with the desperate measures of people who had risked everything to protect someone they loved. The girl who had vanished in plain sight had been spirited away by an elaborate conspiracy of maternal devotion that had sustained itself for 19 years through meticulous planning and unwavering loyalty. As the room fell silent, Miss Marple reflected on the human complexities that had driven such extraordinary measures. The mystery of Iris Finch had revealed itself to be not a crime, but a testament to the lengths people would go to protect those they loved from consequences they feared would be unbearable. The challenge now would be finding a way to acknowledge the truth while preserving the dignity of all involved, transforming a secret that had required such elaborate concealment into a future that could accommodate both legal necessity and human compassion. The weight of Mrs. Red Winter's admission settled over the assembled company like evening mist, bringing with it the recognition that 19 years of careful deception had finally reached its inevitable conclusion. Miss Marple, who had observed the delicate interplay of love and desperation that had sustained this elaborate protection for nearly 2 decades, understood that the real challenge lay not in exposing the truth, but in managing its revelation with the dignity that all parties deserved. It was Miss Marple who suggested, with the gentle authority that belonged to someone who had spent a lifetime understanding human nature, that perhaps the time had come to complete the circle that had been so carefully maintained for so long. "I took the liberty," she said mildly, "of mentioning to young Tom that if a certain symbol were to appear again on the service gate, it might serve to bring this matter to its proper conclusion." Inspector Chittenden, who had learned to recognize the quiet wisdom in her suggestions, agreed that such an approach might prove more effective than continued official pressure. As twilight settled over Elmsford, a small 5-petaled flower appeared on the familiar post, drawn with the same practiced hand that had been leaving discreet instructions around the village for nearly 20 years. The inspector positioned his men where they could observe without alarming, while Miss Marple returned to the vicarage with the serene confidence of someone who understood that truth, when properly invited, would reveal itself in its own time. The response came within the hour. Tom Pierce's motor car approached the hall's entrance with the careful precision of someone who had been entrusted with responsibilities that extended far beyond his usual mechanical expertise. From the passenger seat emerged Iris Finch, wearing a simple traveling dress of dark blue wool. Her composure, speaking of someone who had spent the intervening hours coming to terms with revelations that had transformed her understanding of her own identity. The reunion that followed possessed the particular poignancy that belongs to relationships finally acknowledged after years of careful concealment. Mrs. Redwinter's embrace of her daughter carried the fierce tenderness of maternal love that could at last be expressed openly, while Julian's awkward greeting revealed his struggle to adjust to discovering a sister he had known in an entirely different capacity. Ruth Prowse, whose unwavering loyalty had sustained the elaborate deception through meticulous planning and constant vigilance, stood with tears streaming down her cheeks, her composed mask finally abandoned in the face of emotions too powerful for further concealment. Miss Marple, observing the scene with the gentle attention she brought to all moments when human relationships were redefined by truth, began to weave together the threads that had created this extraordinary tapestry of protection and deception. The 5-petaled cinquefoil, she explained, had served not merely as the Redwinter family emblem, but as a sophisticated communication system that had allowed Ruth to coordinate the complex arrangements necessary to maintain Iris's carefully constructed life. Every detail, Miss Marple observed with quiet admiration, from the iodine stains that marked hasty medical treatments to the blue paint flakes that traced Ruth's desperate attempts to control evidence, spoke of someone whose devotion extended to the smallest particulars. The compact mirror with its hidden birth record fragment, the systematically destroyed parish registers, even the carefully orchestrated break-ins, all represented Ruth's meticulous efforts to protect a secret that she believed, in her fierce loyalty, would only bring harm if revealed carelessly. Iris herself, when invited to explain her role in the elaborate disappearance, spoke with the measured clarity of someone who had used her time away to understand the full implications of her changed circumstances. The plan had been developed over weeks, she revealed, as Ada Vale's investigation had made it clear that the careful arrangements protecting her identity were approaching their inevitable end. The Rose Show had provided perfect cover. With its natural distractions and the convenient moment when the canvas was lowered to create the corridor of concealment that had made her seemingly impossible disappearance possible. Ada Vale's professional satisfaction at reaching a resolution was tempered by her recognition of the human complexities involved. The inheritance that had driven her investigation, she explained, represented her client's attempt to provide for his natural daughter before his death. The trust required acknowledgement before Iris's 20th birthday, which approached in mere weeks, making the systematic destruction of birth records not merely an act of protective secrecy, but a threat to Iris's financial security and legal standing. Inspector Chittenden, faced with a case that had resolved itself through patient observation rather than dramatic detection, found himself documenting a mystery that had been solved not by police work, but by understanding the lengths to which ordinary people would go to protect those they loved. The various crimes that had accompanied the investigation, from the break-ins to the assault on Mr. Lenton, were acknowledged as the desperate measures of people who had risked everything to maintain a deception they believed was necessary for Iris's well-being. The practical arrangements that followed required delicate negotiation between legal necessity and social convention. The inheritance would indeed be claimed, but the revelation of Iris's parentage would be managed with the discretion that protected all parties from unnecessary scandal. Mrs. Redwinter's acknowledgment of her daughter would be presented as the correction of long-standing arrangements rather than the exposure of shameful secrets, allowing the family to move forward with their dignity intact. Mrs. Finch, summoned to witness the resolution of the mystery that had touched her life so profoundly, listened with the quiet strength of someone who had loved Iris as her own daughter for 19 years. The knowledge of the girl's true parentage, though long suspected in the quiet corners of her maternal heart, did not diminish that love but rather completed her understanding of the complex web of affection that had surrounded the child she had raised with such devoted care. As the formal arrangements were concluded and the various participants began to absorb the implications of their new reality, Miss Marple reflected on the extraordinary nature of what she had witnessed. The girl who had vanished in plain sight had been spirited away, not by criminal intent, but by a conspiracy of love that had sustained itself through meticulous planning, unwavering loyalty, and the sort of protective instinct that could drive ordinary people to accomplish seemingly impossible things. The village of Elmsford, though it would always remember the day the Rose Queen disappeared, would gradually come to understand the deeper currents that had moved beneath its placid surface. The bunting from the interrupted celebration still fluttered in the evening breeze, now seeming to commemorate not a simple ceremony, but a complex human drama that had revealed the extraordinary lengths to which people would go to protect those they held most dear. Walking back through the village in the gentle twilight, Miss Marple considered the curious patterns of human behavior that had created this elaborate mystery. People's attempts to shield those they loved from harm often required deceptions that ultimately served only to delay inevitable reckonings with truth. Yet the love that motivated such efforts remained genuine and worthy of respect, even when the methods proved misguided. The Rose Show would be remembered not for its shocking interruption, but for the revelation that even the most carefully guarded secrets could be acknowledged with compassion when approached with patience and understanding. Miss Marple smiled to herself as she reflected on how the most puzzling mysteries often resolved themselves not through brilliant deduction, but through the simple recognition that people, when observed with sufficient patience and sympathy, inevitably revealed their true natures through the accumulation of small, telling details that spoke more eloquently than any confession ever could. In her modest sitting room, surrounded by the familiar comforts of needlework and well-worn books, Miss Marple reflected on the enduring truth that had guided her through another complex investigation. Human nature, in all its complexity and contradiction, remained the most reliable guide to understanding the mysteries that disrupted the peaceful surface of village life. The girl who had vanished in plain sight had returned not merely to claim an inheritance, but to step into her true identity. And the elaborate deception that had protected her for 19 years had finally transformed into the foundation for an honest future built on acknowledged love rather than necessary lies.